The year was 530. In the scorching heat of Mesopotamia, right before the walls of the fortress of Dara, two armies stood face to face. On one side, the Sassanid Empire's war machine, 40,000 men, the finest cavalry the world had ever seen, elite archers, war elephants. On the other, just 25,000 Byzantine soldiers, and at their head, a 25-year-old commander who had never won a major battle in his life, Belisarius. The Persian commander looked at the numbers and smiled. He had every reason to, because 40,000 against 25,000 meant only one thing mathematically: certain victory. But there was something on the plain of Dara that mathematics could not account for, something buried in the earth, something hidden in plain sight, something no Persian general had noticed: a trench. That day, 40,000 Persian soldiers advanced without knowing where they were stepping. And that day, the entire world learned that numbers mean nothing. The sun was directly overhead. No wind, not even dust rising from the ground, just the heat, pressing down like a hand on the back of your neck, and silence. The kind of silence that comes before battle, when 10,000 men hold their breath at the same time, and the plain itself seems to stop moving. Belisarius sat still on his horse. He looked ahead. The Persian line stretched to the horizon, a dark, heaving wall of men and horses and iron that seemed to breathe as one organism. Standards caught the light. Somewhere deep in those ranks, war elephants shifted their weight, and the ground trembled faintly, the way it does before an earthquake, when only animals and the very attentive feel it. He looked down, at the ground, at the earth his men had spent 3 nights cutting open with their hands and their tools, in total darkness, working in shifts so that no sound would carry across the plain. The trench was there, hidden in the dry ground, angled precisely, invisible from a distance. Not deep enough to swallow a man whole, but deep enough. Deep enough to break a cavalry charge, deep enough to turn order into chaos, deep enough to make 40,000 men suddenly worth 25,000. He said nothing, he simply waited.
To understand what was about to happen on this plain, you have to understand one thing first. This was not just a battle between two armies. This was a collision between two worlds, two philosophies of war that had been building toward each other for decades. The Sassanid Persian Empire was the most powerful military force on earth. It had been for generations. Their cavalry, the famous Savaran, were the finest heavy horsemen alive. Armored from head to foot, mounted on horses bred for war, trained from childhood for one purpose and one purpose only: to charge, to break, to destroy. They had done it to every enemy they had ever faced. They had done it to Rome before. They would do it again. Or so they believed. On the Byzantine side, the situation was different. The Eastern Roman Empire, Constantinople's empire, had been fighting Persia on and off for centuries along this eastern frontier. Mesopotamia was the wound that never healed. Fortresses changed hands, treaties were signed and broken, men died in the sand and the cities burned, and 10 years later it started again. Dara itself, the fortress city whose walls stood behind Belisarius now, had been built specifically as a bulwark against Persian invasion, and the Persians had never stopped resenting its existence. The man standing between those walls and that army was young, absurdly young by the standards of the age, 25 years old, tall, composed, with the kind of stillness that either comes from extraordinary courage or from having thought so carefully about a problem that fear has simply run out of room. He had fought before, Skirmishes, raids, the small wars of the frontier, but nothing like this, nothing at this scale, nothing where the consequences of failure would be felt from Constantinople to the Euphrates. Emperor Justinian had given him this command. That alone was remarkable. Justinian was not a man who gave commands carelessly. He was building something, restoring the empire, piece by piece, city by city, and he needed men around him who were not merely brave, but precise. Belisarius was precise. Even at 25, there was something about the way he looked at a problem, a terrain, a set of numbers, an enemy's habits that suggested he was always calculating 3 steps ahead of the conversation everyone else was having. He had spent weeks studying the plain of Dara before the Persians arrived, walking it, riding it, lying flat on the ground and looking along the surface to see how the light fell, how the dust moved, where the earth was harder and where it was softer. He had asked questions that his officers found strange. Not how many men do we have, not how many do they have, but where will their cavalry charge and what will stop them when they do? The answer to that question was buried in the ground in front of him now.
3 nights before the battle, he had called his senior officers together. The tent was lit by oil lamps. Maps covered the table, hand-drawn, detailed, showing every rise and depression of the plain outside. Belisarius. They will charge the center. That is what Persian cavalry does. It has always worked. They have no reason to believe it will not work again. General Boozes. And when they charge? When they charge, the center will give ground, slowly. Not panic, retreat, controlled retreat. We pull them forward. A silence settled over the tent. Boozes looked at the map, then at the other officers. If the center retreats, the flanks are exposed. The flanks will not be where the enemy expects them to be. He placed his hand flat on the map. His finger traced a line, not the front line, but a line set back, angled inward like the sides of a funnel. The Hunnic cavalry on both flanks will hold here, not advance, hold. Let the Persians flow past them on either side, chasing the center. Then, when they are fully committed, when every horseman they have is pouring through, the flanks close behind them. No one spoke. That requires perfect timing. Yes. If the flanks move too early, the Persians turn and fight them. If they move too late, the center collapses before the trap closes. Yes. Another silence. And you believe we can hold that timing? Belisarius looked at him, not with arrogance, with something quieter than arrogance, certainty. I believe we have no other choice, so we will hold it. He straightened up and looked at every face in the tent. The plan is not complicated. It is precise. There is a difference. That night, long after the officers had returned to their units, Belisarius sat alone at the entrance of his tent. The camp was quiet. Fires burned low. Somewhere in the distance, on the Persian side of the plain, he could see the glow of their camp. Massive, sprawling, the firelight of 40,000 men eating and sleeping and sharpening their blades. He did not sleep. He sat and thought about the ground, about the trench, about the angle of the flanks, about the Hunnic horsemen, excellent fighters, unpredictable allies, and whether they would hold their nerve when the moment came. About the center and whether his infantry could retreat in order without breaking into a rout. About all the things that had to go right simultaneously for this to work. He thought about his men, about the ones who would not come back tomorrow evening, about how many of them had families in Constantinople or Antioch or some small village along the Bosphorus, how many of them had come to this burning plain believing that their general knew what he was doing. He hoped he did. Then he folded the thought away. He returned to his maps. He went over the plan one more time, not because he had forgotten it, but because repetition was a form of prayer for men who did not have the luxury of doubt. The stars over Mesopotamia are enormous. In the desert, without the smoke of cities, they press down close to the earth, and on a clear night you can almost believe you could reach up and touch them. Belisarius looked at them for a long moment. Then he went inside. Tomorrow had already been decided. All that remained was to execute it.
There is a particular kind of silence that fills a command tent the night before a battle. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of men who have run out of questions. Not because all the questions have been answered, but because they understand, finally, that asking more questions will not change what morning brings. Belisarius stood at the head of the table. Around him, his senior commanders sat or stood in the lamplight: Buzes, Kuzes, the Herulian officer Pharis, and half a dozen others whose names history would remember only faintly, if at all. The maps were spread across the table. The oil lamps threw long shadows across the lines and marks and notations that represented, in the cold language of military planning, the difference between survival and annihilation. He was 25 years old. In another life, in a life with more time, more experience, more battles behind him, he might have stood there with the easy authority of a man who had done this before. He had not done this before, not at this scale, not with these stakes, not with 40,000 enemies camped 3 miles across a flat, open plain with nowhere to hide and no terrain advantage worth speaking of, and a political situation back in Constantinople that left absolutely no room for failure. He looked at the maps. Then he looked at his commanders. Let me tell you exactly what is going to happen tomorrow. Not what might happen, what will happen if every man in this tent does precisely what I am about to describe. No one reached for water. No one shifted in their seat. The lamplight flickered. The Persians will attack the center. They always attack the center. It is what their cavalry is designed to do: mass, charge, break the line, pour through the gap. It has worked for them for 100 years. It will work again tomorrow, unless we give them a field that is not what it appears to be. He placed both hands flat on the map. The field is not what it appears to be. The trench system had taken 3 nights to complete. 3 nights of absolute silence, no torches, no talking above a whisper, tools wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound of digging. The men had worked in 2-hour rotations, crawling back to camp before dawn, sleeping through the day, returning after dark. For 72 hours, the plain of Dara had looked completely still to Persian eyes. Underneath it, 300 soldiers had been reshaping the ground. The result was a T-shaped network of ditches, 2 channels cut into the earth at precise right angles to each other. The first channel ran horizontally across the center of the Byzantine line, not deep enough to stop a man on foot, not wide enough to halt a horse completely. That was deliberate. A trench designed to stop the Persian cavalry outright would be obvious from a distance. The Persians would see it, adjust their angle of attack, and simply go around it. This trench was designed to do something more subtle, to redirect. When the Persian heavy cavalry charged the center and hit that horizontal channel, they would not stop. They would break formation. The horses would balk. Riders would pull left or right instinctively. The tight geometric precision of a Persian charge, the thing that made it lethal, would dissolve into confused clusters of horsemen, all trying to find a way through. And in that moment of confusion, they would be funneled, pushed inward toward the second channel. The second channel ran perpendicular to the first, straight back from the center, like the stem of a T. Narrower, deeper, a killing ground with walls on both sides, designed not to trap the enemy's horses, but to trap their formation, to take an army that fought as a single synchronized instrument and break it into pieces small enough to fight. Pharis, and if they see it, before they reach it? From a distance, in this light, on this terrain, they will not see it. The soil color is consistent. We were careful. But if they do, if they see the first trench, they slow down,
Slowing down gives our archers time. If they try to go around it, they move toward the flanks. The flanks are where we want them." He said it without drama, as if he had already played this game 10 times in his head, and every variation led to the same outcome.
"The plan has 3 parts. All 3 must work. I will go through each one." He moved his finger to the center of the map. "First, the center will appear weak, not accidentally weak, deliberately, visibly, unmistakably weak. I want the Persians to look at our center and feel certain. I want their commander to see a line that is thinner than it should be and think, there, that is where we go. We will invite them in." And our men in the center, they hold? They hold until the charge hits the trench. Then they give ground, slowly, organized retreat, not rout, not panic, step by step, pulling the Persians forward and deeper. The center's job is not to win. The center's job is to make the Persians believe they are winning. He moved his finger to the left edge of the map, then the right. "Second, the flanks. Faris, your Herulian archers will position here on the left ridge, elevated ground, angled sight lines. When the Persian cavalry commits to the center, you do not charge, you do not move forward. You wait, you shoot. Every arrow into that mass of horsemen pushing toward the center is one more reason for them to push faster, deeper, further in." Faris nodded once. On both flanks, set back and hidden from the Persian line of sight, the Hunnic cavalry. 600 on the left, 600 on the right. They will not move until I send the signal, not when the Persians begin their charge, not when the center gives ground, not when it looks like everything is falling apart, and at some point tomorrow it will look exactly like everything is falling apart. They do not move. A long pause. They move when the Persians are fully inside, when there is no clean path of retreat, when the trap has walls on all 4 sides. Only then. How will they know? The signal, in that noise, in that dust. They will know. He said it quietly, not as reassurance, as fact.
"And if they cross the trenches, if the cavalry gets through?" The tent went still. It was the question everyone had been holding. Belisarius looked at Buzes for a moment, not with irritation, with something that looked almost like gratitude, the look of a man who is glad someone finally said the thing out loud. "Let them through." Silence. If a Persian horseman crosses the trench, it means he's separated from his formation to do it. It means he is alone, or nearly alone, on our side of the line. A single cavalryman who has just jumped a ditch, surrounded by infantry, with his formation behind him and no support, that man is not a threat, he is a target. He leaned forward. The moment they cross that trench, the trap has closed. Crossing it is not escaping the plan. Crossing it is completing it. No one answered, because there was nothing left to answer.
He sent them out an hour before midnight, each commander back to his unit, carrying the plan in his head, responsible for translating it into the language of his particular soldiers, the Hunnic riders who followed their own chiefs, the Herulian archers with their own customs, the Byzantine infantry who were professionals but had never faced a full Persian assault at this scale. Belisarius stayed at the table after they left. He knew the plan was good. He had thought about it for weeks, walked the ground himself, checked every angle. The trench positioning was correct. The flank timing, if held, was lethal. The logic of it, the internal logic, the way each part depended on and enabled the others, was sound. He also knew that plans were sound until the moment they met 40,000 men who had not read them. He thought about the Hunnic cavalry, excellent fighters, fast, instinctive, devastating in open pursuit,
But the Huns did not fight the way Byzantine soldiers fought. They fought the way they had always fought, on instinct and momentum, and asking them to stay still while a battle raged 50 meters in front of them was asking them to fight against every reflex they had ever developed. He had spoken to their chiefs. They had agreed. He believed them. But believing a man and trusting the moment he is tested are two different things. He thought about the center, about the infantry commanders who would have to hold their men in a controlled retreat while Persian cavalry bore down on them, who would have to look at a charge and not run, who would have to feel the earth shake and still move backward in order, one step at a time, drawing the enemy forward like a hand pulling a thread. He thought about all the things he could not control. Then he stopped thinking about them, because a commander who cannot stop thinking about what he cannot control will not sleep, and a commander who does not sleep will make mistakes in the afternoon that he would never make in the morning. He rolled the maps. He extinguished the lamps one by one. He stood for a moment in the darkness of the tent, listening to the camp around him, the low sounds of men trying to rest, the distant movement of horses. Somewhere far across the plain, the faint and alien noise of the Persian camp settling into its own uneasy night. Morning was coming. Everything was ready. All that remained was to find out if ready was enough.
3 miles across the plain, the night looked completely different. The Persian camp was not quiet. It was never quiet, not because the men were undisciplined, but because 40,000 soldiers generate a particular kind of noise that has nothing to do with disorder. It is the noise of confidence, the low, constant hum of an army that has done this before, that knows how these things go, that has looked at the numbers and found them satisfying. Fires burned high. Food was being cooked. Horses were being fed and groomed with the unhurried attention of men who expect their animals to work hard tomorrow and want them ready. There was laughter in some corners of the camp, not nervous laughter, the easy laughter of men who feel no need to be afraid. At the center of it all, in a command tent 3 times the size of anything on the Byzantine side of the plain, the generals of the Sassanid Empire had gathered. They were not young men. Most of them had been fighting since before Belisarius had learned to ride. They had campaigned across Mesopotamia, into Armenia, along the edges of the Arabian desert. They had broken Roman armies before, not once, not twice, but repeatedly in engagement after engagement across a frontier that had been bleeding for generations. They carried that history in the way they sat, in the way they spread their hands across maps, in the particular unhurried certainty of men who have been right too many times to believe they might be wrong. The commander at the head of the table was Firuz, a senior general of the Sassanid court, experienced, respected, politically connected in the way that all men who reach the upper levels of Persian military command must be. He was not reckless. History would be wrong to remember him that way. He was a product of a system that had worked magnificently, repeatedly, at scale, and he was applying that system to a situation that appeared, by every visible measurement, to call for nothing more than its standard operation. He looked at the maps, he looked at his generals, he looked entirely at ease. Let us go through it one more time, not because there is doubt, there is no doubt, but because tomorrow must be executed cleanly. He moved his hand across the map. The Byzantine position was marked in detail, the walls of Dara behind them, the lines of infantry across the plain, the rough positions of the flanking cavalry. 25,000 men against 40,000 on open ground. He paused, not for effect. He simply let the arithmetic sit in the air for a moment, the way a man might let an obvious truth breathe before moving on from it. Their only hope was terrain. They have none. Their only alternative was the fortress walls. They chose not to hide behind them.
That decision tells us something about their commander. He is young. He wants to be seen fighting in the open. He wants reputation. We will give him a lesson instead. There was quiet laughter around the table, not contemptuous, easy, the laughter of men who have seen young commanders make this mistake before. The Sassanid military was, at this point in history, the finest professional army in the world. That is not exaggeration. It is the considered verdict of every serious historian who has examined the period. The Sassavaron, the heavy cavalry that formed the elite core of the Persian force, were armored in lamellar plate from helmet to shin, mounted on horses bred specifically for war over generations, trained in formations and maneuvers of extraordinary complexity. They did not simply charge, they executed. A Persian heavy cavalry charge was not a mob of horsemen riding fast. It was a precise, geometric event, a wall of iron moving at controlled speed in coordinated waves, designed to hit an infantry line at exactly the right angle with exactly the right mass to fold it inward on itself. It had folded Roman lines before. It had folded them at Singara, at Nisibis, at engagements whose names had mostly faded from memory, but whose outcomes had not. The Eastern Roman Empire had spent the better part of 2 centuries learning to respect Persian cavalry, and that respect had been earned at considerable cost. Behind the cavalry, Persian infantry held the flanks in the rear, disciplined, experienced, capable of holding ground while the cavalry did its work. And woven through the entire formation, Persian archers, composite bow, extraordinary range, trained from childhood, could project fire across distances that changed the mathematics of an open engagement entirely. 40,000 of these men against 25,000. Firuz looked at his generals and felt not arrogance, but the particular quiet satisfaction of a man who has been handed a problem with an obvious solution.
It was one of the younger generals, a cavalry commander named Adarmahan, who first raised the question that should have changed everything. He had been studying the map for several minutes in silence, his finger tracing the line of the Byzantine position, pausing at the mark that indicated the trench system running across the center of the plain. Adarmahan. This. He tapped the mark on the map. They dug this in the last 3 nights. We saw the movement. We thought it was repositioning. But look at the angle. Look at the shape of it. There are 2 channels, not 1. The second runs perpendicular to the first. A few generals leaned forward. Firuz looked at the map without changing his expression. Adarmahan. A single trench across the front makes sense as a defensive barrier. You dig it to stop a charge. But a perpendicular channel behind it serves a different purpose. It does not stop movement. It directs it. A brief silence. If I were building a trap, Firuz, you would build walls, not ditches, and you would need numbers you do not have. Adarmahan. Sir. Firuz. They dug those trenches because they are afraid of our cavalry. It is the most natural thing in the world. A commander who knows he cannot match our horsemen tries to find a way to slow them down. He digs obstacles. He hopes to break our momentum before we reach his line. He looked at Adarmahan with patience, not hostility. That is a reasonable instinct. It is also insufficient. Look at the center. The trench does not cover it completely. There is a path through. Adarmahan. Or the path through is intentional. The tent went quiet for just a moment, that specific quality of silence that descends when someone has said something that cannot be immediately dismissed, but that no one is prepared to accept. Firuz looked at him. You believe a 25-year-old Byzantine commander, outnumbered by nearly 2 to 1, has dug a trench system specifically designed to invite us in? Adarmahan. I believe it is worth considering. Firuz. I believe it is worth finishing this meeting and getting some sleep. He said it without cruelty, with the measured finality of a senior man closing a conversation that has run its useful course. Adarmahan said nothing more. He sat back, He looked at the map once more, at that perpendicular channel, at the gap in the center, and then he looked away. The conversation moved on.
The plan Firuz outlined was, by conventional military logic, entirely correct. Mass the heavy cavalry, direct the charge at the Byzantine center, visibly the thinnest, most vulnerable part of the line. Use the gap in the trench to push through. Once through, the cavalry splits, half turns left, half turns right, rolling up the Byzantine flanks from behind while the infantry presses forward from the front. Standard envelopment, textbook execution, the kind of maneuver that had destroyed armies on this same stretch of frontier before. The plan was approximately 50% accurate. The trench was real, the gap in the center was real, the relative weakness of the Byzantine center was real. Every piece of intelligence the Persians had gathered, every observation their scouts had made, every inference their experienced commanders had drawn from the visible evidence in front of them, all of it was correct. What it could not account for was the thing that was not visible, the thing that no scout had seen and no inference had reached. That the gap was there because Belisarius had left it there. That the center was weak because Belisarius had made it weak. That the trench did not block the path of the Persian cavalry, it guided it, precisely, deliberately, with geometric care, toward a killing ground that would not exist until the moment the Persians entered it and the flanks closed behind them. Firuz did not know this. He could not have known it from the outside. The plan he had built was the plan that the battlefield, as he understood it, demanded. He was not wrong to build it. He was simply reading a map that had been drawn by someone else, for a purpose he had not been invited to understand. He dismissed his generals close to midnight. They left in ones and twos, back to their units, back to their fires. The camp outside was settling, not into silence, but into the lower, slower rhythm of an army that has made its decisions and is now simply waiting for morning to confirm them. Firuz stood at the entrance of his tent for a moment before going inside. The plain was dark. Across it, somewhere invisible in the distance, the Byzantine camp burned its smaller, quieter fires. He thought about the young commander over there, 25 years old, no major victories, a reputation built on frontier skirmishes and the goodwill of an emperor who apparently valued potential over experience. He almost felt something like pity. Tomorrow it ends. He said it to no one, to the plain, to the dark. Then he went inside. It began with sound. Not the clash of weapons, that came later. It began with something lower, something felt more in the chest than heard with the ears. A vibration that rose through the soles of your boots and traveled up through your legs and settled somewhere behind your sternum like a second heartbeat. 40,000 men shifting from stillness to motion across 3 miles of flat ground produces a frequency that the human body registers before the mind catches up. And on the Byzantine left flank, the soldiers standing in their lines felt it before any scout brought the word. The word came anyway, a few minutes later. Breathless, a rider pulling his horse up short behind the Byzantine lines, dust coming off him in sheets. The Persians were moving. The morning had started with a peculiar stillness, not peace. The plain of Dara had not known peace in a generation, but the suspended, glassy quiet of 2 armies watching each other across open ground, each waiting for the other to make the first commitment. The sun had climbed, the heat had arrived with it, the dry, pressing heat of Mesopotamia in summer that turns the inside of a helmet into a slow oven and makes the air above the ground shimmer and bend so that distant objects seem to float untethered from the earth. Byzantine soldiers stood in their formations and sweated and did not speak. Some of them had been standing since before dawn. Their mouths were dry, their armor was already hot to the touch.
Across the plain, the Persian lines were a dark mass that shifted and breathed, and occasionally caught the light on a spear tip or a polished shield plate, small flashes of brightness in the haze, like signals from another world. Then the haze thickened, not with heat, with dust. The Persian left flank was moving. 10,000 cavalry. That was the first wave, not the full force. Firuz was not a man who committed everything at the opening. He was methodical. The left flank attack was a probe with mass behind it, designed to test the Byzantine right, find the seams in their line, determine where the resistance was real and where it was performance. 10,000 horsemen was enough to break a flank that could be broken. If it couldn't be broken, he would learn that too and adjust. They came at a controlled canter, not the flat-out charge of a committed assault, but the rolling, building momentum of cavalry that is covering ground and gathering speed at the same time. The sound of them was extraordinary, not a roar, something more complex than a roar. The percussion of 40,000 hooves hitting dry earth in overlapping rhythms, the metallic undertone of armor and equipment moving together, the occasional sharp crack of a horse pushing harder, and the brief gap in the rhythm when it did. And underneath all of it, faintly, the breathing of the animals themselves, enormous, effortful, the sound of immense power in motion. The ground shook, not metaphorically. The ground physically shook, and men who had been standing still on the Byzantine left flank felt it through their feet and looked at each other and did not say what they were thinking. The Persian archers came first. That was standard Sassanid tactical doctrine. Advance the archers ahead of the cavalry, use their range to disorder the enemy line before the horsemen hit it, break formation with arrows before you break bodies with iron. The composite bows the Persian archers carried could send an arrow through light armor at 150 meters. At close range, they could penetrate almost anything that wasn't heavy plate. They moved forward in groups, loosing in coordinated volleys, not individually, not at random, but in timed waves that sent arrows into the Byzantine left flank in sequences designed to keep men's shields up, keep their heads down, prevent them from organizing a response, while the cavalry closed the distance behind. The arrows came in with a sound like tearing fabric. Then the impact sounds, wood, leather, occasionally something harder and worse. Men on the Byzantine left flank began to fall. Not many. The formations held their shields, and Byzantine infantry equipment in this period was adequate against arrow fire at distance. But some. Enough. And the Byzantine left flank began to give ground.
It looked like panic. From the Persian side, from any reasonable distance, it looked exactly like what a flank looks like when it starts to break. The shuffling backward of men who are absorbing fire they cannot answer, the slight collapse of formation as individuals begin making individual decisions about how much further forward they are willing to stand, the visible contraction of the line as it folds back toward the center. It was not panic. Every step backward on that flank had been rehearsed. Not in the way a parade ground maneuver is rehearsed, not with drums and formal commands, but in the private instructions given to every file commander on that wing in the days before the battle. Give ground. Do not rout. Give ground. The difference between the two is everything. A rout is contagious. A controlled withdrawal is a message. The message it was sending to the Persian cavalry now building speed behind the archers was, they are breaking, push harder, come further. The Persian cavalry read the message exactly as intended. Come further. The order that moved through the Persian left wing at that moment was not complicated. The flank was giving. The archers had done their work. The path was open. Drive forward. Push through the gap before the Byzantine line could reform. Get around behind them, and the left flank ceases to be a flank. It becomes a pocket. 10,000 horsemen accelerated. The ground shook harder. On the Byzantine left, men who were performing a controlled retreat looked over their shoulders at what was coming and needed every instinct they had to keep performing it. Because what was coming looked like the end. It looked like the specific thing that ends battles and ends lives and ends the particular kind of hope you have when you are standing in a line with your friends and believing that the plan will work and that the man who made the plan knows what he is doing. It looked like 10,000 horses at a full charge. They kept retreating, one step at a time, drawing the Persians forward, deeper, further from their own lines, further into ground that was no longer quite what it appeared to be.
The Hunnic cavalry had been waiting since before dawn. 600 riders, positioned on the far left of the Byzantine line, angled back and slightly elevated on a shallow rise that the terrain offered, not a hill, barely even a ridge, but enough to break line of sight from the Persian position if you placed your horses correctly and kept them still. Hunnic horses were trained to be still. It was one of the things that made Hunnic cavalry different from almost every other mounted force of the era. Their animals did not fidget, did not call out, did not betray position the way poorly trained horses do when they sense other horses nearby and want to announce themselves. 600 riders, still, watching. Their commander, a chief whose name the Byzantine chronicles record in transliteration imprecisely as it was passed through Greek scribes unfamiliar with the original, had received his instructions from Belisarius 3 nights earlier and had asked only one question: when? When you cannot imagine waiting any longer, and then you wait a little more. The chief had not smiled. He had nodded once with the particular expression of a man who understands perfectly and intends to comply and is already calculating the moment in his head. He was calculating it now. The Persian cavalry was deep into its charge. The Byzantine left was still giving ground, still controlled, still retreating in order, though the distance between the retreating infantry and the advancing horsemen was closing fast. The dust cloud from 10,000 horses had risen high enough now to change the quality of light on that part of the field, a reddish-brown haze that made everything inside it indistinct, that swallowed formations and individual men and turned the whole engagement into a churning, roaring abstraction. The chief looked at it for one more second. Then he raised his arm.
The Huns came around the edge of the dust cloud at an angle no Persian horseman was watching. They came fast. Hunnic cavalry in open pursuit was among the fastest military movement available in the ancient world, and they came from a direction that the Persian charge had already passed, which meant the Persian left flank was not facing them. The Persian left flank had no rear guard in position. It had committed forward into the dust, into the pursuit of a Byzantine line it believed was breaking. It was breaking, just not in the direction anyone on the Persian side had planned for. The collision was brief. That is the honest word for it, brief. In military terms, what happened on the Byzantine left flank in the space of the next 10 minutes was a complete reversal of a 10,000-man assault by a force less than a tenth its size. And the reason it was possible is that momentum, once fully committed in a single direction, is catastrophically vulnerable to pressure from any other direction. The Persian charge had all its weight going forward. 600 Hunnic riders hit its exposed flank and rear, and the charge did not stop. Charges do not stop that cleanly, but it folded. It buckled at the edges. Horses turned in confusion. Riders who had been pushing forward suddenly had no formation behind them and threats beside them, and the clean tactical logic of the charge dissolved into 100 individual crises happening simultaneously. 3,000 Persian cavalrymen did not return from that flank by the time the dust began to settle. Some were dead, some were unhorsed and captured. The rest were retreating, not an organized withdrawal, not a tactical repositioning, retreating in the specific disordered way that men retreat when something has happened that they do not yet fully understand.
The survivors came back to the Persian lines in ones and threes, covered in dust, horses breathing hard, and they brought with them something more damaging than their casualties. They brought uncertainty.
Firuz received the report without visible reaction. He stood outside his command post and listened to the account from a cavalry officer who was choosing his words carefully, not to soften the news, but because he was still processing it himself and was not entirely sure what he had witnessed. Firuz said nothing for a long moment. He looked across the plain. The dust cloud on the left was beginning to thin. The Byzantine left flank, the one that had been retreating, breaking, collapsing toward the center, was no longer retreating. It had reformed. It was holding. He looked at the Byzantine center, still thin, still apparently weak, still the same gap in the trench line that his plan had been built around. He thought about what Ardamohan had said the night before, about the perpendicular channel, about the gap that might be intentional. He stood with that thought for several seconds. Then he set it aside. One flank engagement, surprise ambush by concealed cavalry, a minor tactical reversal, irritating but not decisive. The center was still open, the plan was still sound. One setback on one flank did not change arithmetic. 40,000 against 25,000. The math had not changed. He turned back to his commanders. The center. We go now.
Firuz did not wait long. The dust from the left flank engagement had barely begun to settle when the orders moved through the Persian right wing. This was not impulsiveness, it was calculation. A commander who absorbs one setback and pauses too long gives his enemy time to consolidate, to breathe, to believe that the worst is over. Firuz understood this. He had been fighting long enough to know that the moment after a reversal is also the moment of maximum psychological opportunity, because the enemy is watching you, waiting to see if you flinch, and if you do not flinch, if you come back immediately, harder, with more, the message it sends is worth 10,000 additional men. He came back immediately, harder, with more. The second assault hit the Byzantine right flank with a weight that the first attack had not carried. This was not a probe. This was not a test of the line's resilience or a move designed to gather intelligence about where the seams were. The Persian right wing, 12,000 cavalry, heavier than the force that had struck the left, supported by a deeper formation of infantry behind them, came forward with the specific momentum of a force that has been told this is the moment and has committed to it completely. The Byzantine right flank felt the difference immediately. Where the left flank attack had built gradually, archers first, then cavalry accelerating behind them, this came all at once, the full mass of it, arriving with a compression of time that turned the distant rumble into immediate noise before anyone had finished processing that it was coming. The Byzantine soldiers on the right had watched the left flank engagement from a distance. They had seen their comrades hold, seen the Hunnic counterattack work, felt the brief surge of belief that comes when a plan appears to be functioning. That belief did not survive the first 10 minutes of what hit them now. The Persian cavalry struck the Byzantine right with enough mass to bend the line immediately, not break it, not yet, but the difference between bending and breaking is mostly a matter of time and pressure, and the pressure was not relenting. Persian archers poured arrows into the compressed Byzantine formation. The right flank infantry, absorbing fire from the front while cavalry pressed from the angle, began to compress inward, men stepping backward into the men behind them, formations losing their geometry, file commanders shouting orders that were lost in the noise before they reached the ears they were meant for. The line held for 8 minutes. Then it did not hold anymore.
There is a specific sound that a military line makes when it breaks. Veterans recognize it before they can see it. A change in the acoustic texture of the battle, a shift from the organized percussion of men fighting in formation to something more chaotic and individual. Belisarius heard it from his position near the center. He did not move. The rider reached him 2 minutes later, a young officer,
his horse lathered, dust caking the left side of his face where he had ridden into the wind. "Oh, the right flank is gone! They're through the line! Persian cavalry inside our position!" Belisarius looked at him. "How far inside?" 500 meters, maybe more. They're still moving." A silence that lasted exactly long enough to feel unbearable. "Do you know what they just did?" The officer stared at him. Around them the command staff was watching, every face tight, every man waiting for the order to respond to a catastrophe. They just walked into a room with no doors. Every meter they advance, the further they are from their own line. Every meter they advance, the closer they are to the second channel. He turned to the map. His finger moved without hesitation. "Belisarius, the right flank units fall back to the secondary position, here. They do not counterattack. They create a wall. The Persians inside the position cannot go forward because of the infantry. They cannot go back because the trench is behind them. And in," he paused, calculating, "less time than you think, they will realize they are not pursuing a broken enemy. They are standing inside a closing fist." The officer looked at the map, then at Belisarius. "And if they realize it before the flanks close? Then we find out how good our infantry is." He said it without looking up from the map.
Inside the Byzantine position, the Persian cavalry that had broken through the right flank was doing what cavalry does when it breaks a line, pushing forward, exploiting the gap, driving deeper into the enemy's interior to maximize the disruption before infantry can respond. It was correct tactical instinct. It was exactly what they were trained to do. In any conventional engagement, on any conventional field, it would have been the beginning of the end for the Byzantine army. The field was not conventional. The trench system that Belisarius had spent 3 nights building had been designed with this exact moment in mind. The horizontal channel across the front had been the visible element, the one the Persians had debated the night before, the one Firuz had assessed and incorporated into his plan. The perpendicular channel running back from the center was the invisible element, the one Adarmahan had almost understood. The Persian horsemen pushing through the broken right flank were riding forward, away from their own lines, deeper into Byzantine-held ground, and the ground was guiding them. Not with walls, not with any obstacle visible from horseback at speed, with geometry. The angle of the Byzantine infantry falling back on either side of the breakthrough funneled the Persian horsemen left toward the center channel. The terrain itself, flat to the eye but precisely cut below it, offered one direction of easier movement and one direction that was suddenly, inexplicably, wrong. The Persians inside the position were riding fast, and they were riding in the direction the ground was letting them ride. That direction led directly into the second trench.
The first horses reached it without warning. One stride, and then the ground that had been there was not there. Animals that had been moving at full gallop had no room to stop, no time to react, no instruction from their riders who had not seen it coming either. The front ranks went into the trench in a cascading collision, horses, riders, equipment, and the ranks behind them, still pushing forward with the momentum of the breakthrough, compressed into the chaos before the signal could travel backward through the formation fast enough to matter. The breakthrough, in the space of approximately 90 seconds, had transformed itself. It was no longer a penetration, it was a pocket. Persian cavalry that had crossed the Byzantine line 60 seconds ago as an unstoppable advancing force was now stationary, compressed, surrounded on 3 sides by infantry that had been waiting in secondary positions, with a trench behind them and an enemy who suddenly appeared to know exactly where they were. In the Persian command post 3 miles away, the reports arriving at Firuz now were slower, more confused, and more alarming than any that had preceded them. The right wing had broken through, that part was confirmed, but something had happened inside, something the scouts could not clearly see through the dust and the distance and the noise. Something had gone wrong. Firuz stood at the edge of his command post and looked at the plain. The dust over the right flank was enormous now, the particular churning, unfocused cloud that forms not over cavalry in motion, but over cavalry in confusion. He thought about the perpendicular channel. He thought about what Adarmahan had said. And somewhere, in a part of his mind that had been right about too many battles to be dismissed, something cold and precise told him that the young Byzantine commander across the plain had not been surprised by any of this. Not once.
There is a principle in military deception that the most dangerous element of any trap is not the one the enemy sees, it is not even the one the enemy suspects. It is the one that does not exist in their thinking at all, the variable that never entered their calculations because they had no reason to look for it. Firuz had known about the Hunnic cavalry on the Byzantine flanks. His scouts had reported them. He had factored them into his planning. What his scouts had not found, what no Persian intelligence in the hours before the battle had located, were the two units that had not been on the flanks at all. They had been behind the Byzantine line, hidden since before dawn, motionless. Sunicus and Aegon were not young men, and they were not inexperienced ones. Both were Hunnic chiefs of significant standing, commanding riders who had been fighting since adolescence, men who could cover ground at speed, change direction without losing formation, and read the geometry of a cavalry engagement the way other men read text. Belisarius had positioned them personally 3 nights before the battle, walking the ground behind his own lines in darkness and placing each unit with a precision that his senior Byzantine officers had found almost obsessive. The position made no sense to anyone who did not know the plan completely. Too far back to intervene in the initial exchanges, too angled to support either flank directly, tucked behind a shallow fold in the terrain that offered concealment but no tactical advantage anyone could immediately identify. It offered exactly one advantage. The Persian right wing, once it broke through the Byzantine line and pushed forward into the trap, would have its back to them. Belisarius had been waiting for this since dawn. Through the left flank attack, through the counterattack, through the second assault, and the chaos of the right flank collapsing. He had watched all of it from his command position with the specific, contained patience of a man who knows that the entire architecture of his plan points toward one moment, and that moving before that moment, by 30 seconds, by 100 meters, destroys everything. The moment was now.
He gave the order without ceremony. A single rider dispatched to each position. No trumpet, no signal flag. Sound and light carried too far on this plain, and the Persians were already looking for anything that moved. The rider reached Sunicus first. The chief looked at the message, looked at his men, looked at the dust cloud 300 meters ahead, where 8,000 Persian cavalrymen were compressed into a pocket they did not yet fully understand they were in. He raised his hand. 600 riders moved. Aegon's unit went simultaneously from the other angle, 100 meters further right, a slightly shallower approach, timed to arrive at the rear of the Persian pocket within seconds of Sunicus rather than minutes. Together, the two units formed a closing jaw, not a wall, not a frontal charge, but a curved, accelerating arc that came around the back of the Persian breakthrough like a hand closing into a fist. They moved without noise, or rather, they moved with the noise of the battle covering them, the enormous ambient roar of the engagement ahead, swallowing the sound of 1,200 horses until the distance had closed too far for it to matter. The first Persian riders to see them were at the very rear of the compressed pocket, men who had been looking forward, toward the Byzantine infantry blocking their advance, toward the trench that had stopped their momentum, and who now turned for reasons they could not immediately articulate. Instinct, perhaps. The particular sensitivity that develops in soldiers who have survived enough engagements to recognize, below the level of conscious thought, when the geometry of a situation has changed. They turned, and they saw what was coming. The cry that moved through the Persian pocket in the next 30 seconds was not a battle cry. It was something else. The specific sound of 8,000 men simultaneously understanding that the ground they are standing on is no longer the ground they thought it was. In front of them, Byzantine infantry, locked and holding. Behind them, Hunnic cavalry closing at speed. On their left, the deep channel of the trench system. On their right, the secondary Byzantine line that had reformed after the breakthrough. 4 walls, no doors.
3 miles away, Firuz stood at the edge of his command post. He had been watching the dust cloud over the right wing with the fixed attention of a man who was trying to read something written too small to see clearly. The reports had stopped making sense 12 minutes ago. First the breakthrough, then confusion, then silence from the officers who should have been sending updates and weren't. Now he could see the new dust, coming from behind his own cavalry, from a direction that should have been empty. An adjutant appeared at his shoulder. "Commander, the right wing. The reports say—" Firuz did not let him finish. He did not need to. He stood and looked at the plain and saw with the awful clarity that comes to experienced commanders in the moment their plan ceases to exist, exactly what had happened. The breakthrough had not been a crack in the Byzantine defense, it had been an invitation. The gap in the right flank had been left there, precisely, deliberately, so that his cavalry would push through it and into a position from which there was no return. He had not been attacking, he had been entering. The trap had not closed around his army had walked into it and pulled it shut from the inside. He said nothing. Around him, his staff waited for an order, any order, something to respond to, something to do with the specific horror of the moment. Firuz gave them nothing. He stood and looked at the dust cloud that contained 8,000 of his men, and he did the only thing left available to him in that moment. He understood. It did not end with a single blow. It ended the way trapped things end, with exhaustion, with the mathematics of enclosed space finally becoming undeniable, with men making individual decisions that collectively become a rout. The Persian cavalry inside the pocket had been fighting for 11 minutes when the formation ceased to exist as a formation. They were still fighting, individual men, individual horses, individual acts of desperation, but the coordinated unit that had broken through the Byzantine right flank was gone. What remained was 8,000 men in a space designed to hold perhaps 2,000 comfortably, pressing against walls that did not give, running out of room to swing a weapon, running out of ground to stand on. Then Baresmanas fell. The senior Persian commander inside the pocket, experienced, respected, the man whose presence had been the last organizing principle keeping the trapped cavalry from complete dissolution, took an arrow at close range and did not rise. The men nearest him saw it, the men behind them saw their faces change, and the information moved outward through the compressed mass of horsemen the way fire moves through dry grass, faster than any rider could carry it, faster than any order could travel in the opposite direction. When a formation loses its commander in the middle of a collapse, it does not fight harder, it stops calculating. The rear ranks broke first, then the middle, then the rest, not in sequence but simultaneously, the whole mass of it converting in the space of seconds from a trapped army to a panicked crowd moving in one direction, which was away.
What followed was not a retreat. A retreat has shape. This had none. 40,000 men, the ones inside the pocket, the ones outside it, the reserves, the archers, the infantry on the flanks, all moving in the same direction at the same time with the specific urgency of men who have stopped thinking about the battle and started thinking about distance. Horses ran into each other, men fell and were not helped. Equipment was dropped without hesitation. Shields, spears, the heavy armor that had made the Savaran invincible an hour ago, and now made them slow. The Persian camp, when the wave reached it, was abandoned in minutes, fires still burning, food still cooking, maps still open on tables. Belisarius gave the pursuit order, limited. His cavalry would follow, pressure the retreat, prevent reorganization, but they would not chase the Persian army to destruction. His men were exhausted. The plain beyond was unknown. And somewhere in the calculus of the decision was something that was not purely strategic. He had won. He did not need their deaths to prove it. Firuz rode without speaking. Around him his staff kept pace and said nothing. There was nothing to say. He had looked at the numbers that morning and found them satisfying. The numbers had not changed. Everything else had. On the plain of Dara, as evening came, the heat finally broke. A wind moved across the ground, the first wind of the day, and it raised the dust over a field that had gone completely quiet. Broken lances, riderless horses standing still, not knowing where to go. The shapes of men in Persian armor lying in the geometry of the trench lines, exactly where the plan had put them. 25,000 men had done this. The ground knew it now.
The sun was going down over Mesopotamia, and the plain was finally quiet. Belisarius walked alone through what remained of the day. Around him, the field gave back its dead slowly, shapes emerging from the settling dust, men and horses, and the broken geometry of equipment that had seemed this morning like the architecture of an inevitable victory. Fires still burned in the abandoned Persian camp across the plain. The wind carried the smell of them. He stopped. A Persian soldier, younger than him if that was possible. A wound he would not survive. Still conscious, looking up at the sky with the specific expression of a man who has finished being afraid and moved into something quieter. Belisarius knelt. He unstoppered his flask and held it to the man's lips. The soldier looked at him. "You are their general? The battle is finished. You are not my enemy anymore." He said nothing else. There was nothing else that needed saying. Later, his general found him standing still in the center of the field. "Our losses, 2,000, perhaps a little more. And theirs, a silence, 10,000, perhaps more." Belisarius looked at the ground. He knelt, not to a wounded man this time, but to the earth itself. He placed his hand flat on the soil. The trench was still there, invisible now in the failing light, but still there. He had not won this battle with numbers. He had won it with a hole in the ground and the patience to wait for 40,000 men to walk into it.